Hello, in this video we will be analysing an answer for the 20 marker past paper question we structured a plan to in the previous video. So if you haven't seen the previous video, please check that out first. So let's quickly remind ourselves of what an AO1 is. An AO1 is the ability to demonstrate knowledge and understanding of the English legal system, legal rules and principles. So this is the content that you've memorized. You need to regurgitate the relevant content, the relevant laws, and write that down on the paper. Then the AO2 is where you apply legal rules, the legal rules and principles, the AO1, to the given scenarios to present a legal argument, and you use appropriate legal terminology. The AO1 is worth 8 marks, the AO2 is worth 12 marks. So when you're writing your answer to the 20 marker, you need to balance it accordingly to the AO1 and to the AO2. So there's going to be more AO2 than AO1. The indicative content is an example of valid content. Any other valid content is acceptable and should be credited in line with the levels of response. It's not expected for candidates to cover all of the indicative content. So you do not have to cover all of this indicative content that they're advising what the answer may include. You don't need to include all of that, and you can include other content that's relevant. So let's now look at the answer. We'll analyze half of the answer, and then I'll allow you to analyze the rest of the answer and use this mark scheme. I'll leave a link to it in the description below, and I'll also leave a link to this answer. And then after that, if you've written your own answer to this question as well, you can mark that. So, Kareem must satisfy the required mens rea of the relevant offences to be convicted for the deaths of Eve, the ferry passengers, and Charlie. This introduction is not necessarily relevant, but it can be useful for the examiner and for you when structuring your answer. The mens rea of murder, as described by Lord Coke, is malice aforethought expressed by the party or implied by law. The case, DPP and Smith, describes expressed and implied malice as intention to cause death or GBH, and direct intent is a strong desire to bring about a consequence. So that was all the AO1, and now the AO1 is going to be applied onto the scenario. Kareem had a direct intent to cause death to both Eve and Charlie, as it's clear he decides to kill them. Directly referencing the scenario here. And then he drives his car at Eve and kills her. So he has the required mens rea at the time of killing. Therefore, Kareem had a direct intention to cause death and would be convicted of Eve's murder. Now remember, for this answer, you must not discuss the specific crimes. You must not discuss murder, manslaughter, or any specific offence. So now let's see what the scenario has to say. So here we have define and explain direct intention. The answers may include the following. Not must, may. These are 3 different ways you can define and explain direct intention. Most serious level of mens rea and required for relatively few offences is indicative of a high level of blameworthiness. That is a definition of direct intention. Direct intent is also described in the case Mohan, a decision to bring about a certain consequence, and Section 8 Criminal Justice Act. Here, in the answer, the case Mohan is used. Not only should I give this an AO1 mark, but I should also credit other valid content. So, it describes expressed and implied malice as intention to cause death or GBH. So I'm explaining the type of mens rea and the type of specific mens rea he needs to be convicted for the crime. So all of this from the top to here is AO1. I'd say it's worth at least 2 marks. So this part is the AO2. So now if we go to the AO2 part of the mark scheme, which is here, AO2, the answers may include the following. In the case of killing Eve, supposed to be written Eve, I also forgot to mention that this mark scheme is not accurate for some reason. It is from OCR and it's from their 2023 paper, so for some reason it's not entirely accurate. But that doesn't matter because we're just using it for a reference to mark this answer here. So in the case of killing Eve, Kareem has decided to bring about the consequence of killing Eve. He deliberately drove the car at her, killing her. His foresight of the consequences was clear. In driving the car at her in order to kill her, intent can at least be inferred. Okay, so in the answer, focused on these two. Kareem had a direct intent to cause death to both Eve and Charlie. And it's also the relevant part of the scenario is stated, showing that we are applying the relevant law to relevant parts of the scenario. And then he drives his car at Eve and kills her, part of the AO2. And then here it's being expanded. So he has the required mens rea at the time of killing. Therefore, Kareem had a direct intention to cause death and would be convicted of murder. Direct intention to cause death. As we explained up here, you need a direct intention to cause death. That's the type of mens rea you need to be convicted of an offence. Your answer should always be directly answering the question. Okay. The next paragraph. As for Charlie and the passengers, Kareem also has direct intent to kill Charlie as he decides to kill them, and he plants a bomb on the ferry that Charlie was supposed to take. However, Charlie wasn't killed as he wasn't on the ferry, but the other passengers were. The case R.V. Latimer states that malice can be transferred from an intended victim to an unintended victim. Also, the case Pembleton reaffirms this, as it states, malice can be transferred from person to person or from object to object. Therefore, using the principle of transferred malice, Kareem's direct intent to kill Charlie would be transferred to the passengers of the ferry, and he'd be held criminally liable for the deaths of the passengers, as he now satisfies the required mens rea of murder via the transferred malice principle. So a lot of legal terminology is being used here, and relevant legal terminology, which is good because that's part of the AO2, and that shows it's a high-level answer. So this part of this mark scheme here talks about oblique intent. Here, this bit talks about transferred malice, so let's read this bit. So it's common law doctrine where mens rea of an offence is transferred to another identical offence. Mens rea of intention is required, not recklessness. Under the doctrine, the law transfers from the intended to the unintended victim, to the actual victim. Case Latimer. Prevents defendant arguing that there was no mens rea for the ultimate victim's injury or damage to an alternative property. The law generally doesn't transfer intent from one crime to another. Pembleton. The answer here goes from the previous question and it joins to the second paragraph. There's a continuation, as we can see here. It starts off with the AO2 and not the AO1. Now, it's generally the exam board advisors, OCR advisors, that you start off with the AO1 and then the AO2 because the AO1 is the basis, it's the content that you apply on the scenario. So the AO1 comes first and the AO2 comes after. But this is also fine. You can still get full marks even if you don't put AO1 first. So let's look at where the AO1 starts. The case Latimer. Okay. States malice can be transferred. So all of this here is a mark for the AO1. And then using the case Pembleton, that'll also be another mark. And then after that, he goes on to the AO2. Could have he written a bit more about transferred malice? Perhaps. If he had written a bit more about transferred malice, more for the AO1, then he would get more marks. But it's fine because we're going to assess his answer at the end and decide what level it goes in. 1, 2, 3 or 4. And as the examiner's reading through your answer, they'll gauge what level your answer's at. So let's read the AO2 part of the indicative content. Killing hundreds of people on the boat. Foresaw the consequence. Virtual certainty. Alternatively, argue transferred malice. Here the first 3 bullet points talks about oblique intent, but in this answer oblique intent isn't used, it's transferred malice. So let's see what the mark scheme says. Transferred malice could be used to gain a conviction for deaths of the passengers, as Kareem clearly intended to kill Charlie. This intent could be transferred to the passengers, and he could be convicted on this basis. That's relatively simple. So we're going to have to credit the answer for other valid content. So this part here is the AO2. All of this is the AO2. Now, I'd say this is probably worth 1 mark because he could have developed his point. He could have said that arguably oblique intent could also be used to convict Kareem of the offence because he could have done it through oblique intent. Some counter arguments at the end will also boost his AO2 marks. And then let's not forget this bit at the beginning here as well. So here he states he had direct intent, and that would be the 2nd mark for the AO2. Let's read the 3rd paragraph now. Kareem doesn't have the direct intent to kill Charlie anymore, as he decides to frighten him, not kill or cause GBH. However, the case, Nedrick, confirmed by Woolen, states that intention can be found where death or GBH was a virtual certain consequence, and the defendant knew that death or GBH was a virtual certain consequence. This test has both a subjective and objective element, and so the jury needs to decide that death or GBH was a virtual certain consequence of Kareem's actions of burning down the garage, and Kareem should know it was a virtual certain consequence. It is highly likely that both tests would be passed, as it is reasonable to say that the house Charlie is in would catch fire from the garage that it's connected to. And if Kareem passes the test, he will have the necessary oblique intent required for him to be convicted of murder for Charlie's death. However, it could be argued that Kareem didn't think it was a virtual certain consequence, as the fire gets out of control. So this bit at the end, this is an example of a counter argument, and that would get you into the level 4 band. It would get you extra marks for the AO2, and it's showing the examiner that you can really explain and argue your point. Let's read the AO1 for oblique intent. Here we are. So you need to define and explain oblique intent, or indirect or implied intention. Oblique intent. The consequence is not the defendant's main aim, but occurs as a direct result of their action and is linked to their foresight of the consequence. Oblique intent has been developed by the courts, in the case Woolen, Matthews and Elaine. So let's see what is written in the answer. So here he starts off again with the AO2, joining the 2 paragraphs, which is fine. The case Nedrick, confirmed by Woolen, that'd be worth 1 AO1 mark. This test has both a subjective and objective element, so the jury needs to decide that death or GBH was a virtual certain consequence of Kareem's actions. That's the AO1 joining into the AO2. It's a very nice flow from the AO1 to the AO2. So let's see what the scenario, the mark scheme, has written for the AO2. In the case of killing Charlie, a jury would need to consider if Kareem was aware of the risk that harm would occur in setting fire to the recycle bin. That was not written in the scenario. So this mark scheme does seem to be a little off. Incorrect. But we can get a general idea of how the answer is supposed to look. He continued to take the risk, but whether the consequent damage would in fact occur or might occur from his actions is questionable. Kareem nevertheless continued regardless of the risk. Okay, so Kareem doesn't have the direct intent to kill Charlie anymore. The answer's identified that he doesn't have the intent anymore, and he references the scenario. He also states that the jury would consider if Kareem was aware of the virtual certain consequence. It's likely that both tests would be passed, and it's reasonable to say that Charlie's house would catch fire from the garage that it's connected to. And this is what is required of a level 4 answer. It doesn't stop there, he keeps going and starts developing his argument. And this is where a lot of the AO2 marks are going to be found. And then this counter argument here would also definitely be worth marks. And then that obviously leads to the next paragraph. The case R.V. Goodfellows deals with a similar scenario in which the defendant was found guilty of burning his own home and his family when the fire got out of control. Subjective recklessness is a lower form of mens rea compared to intention, and the case Cunningham states that the defendant must see the risk but nevertheless take it. Kareem could also satisfy the mens rea of unlawful act manslaughter via subjective recklessness, and the jury would need to decide if Kareem saw the risk of the house burning along with Charlie inside of it but nevertheless took it. In conclusion, Kareem would have the necessary mens rea of murder for Eve and the ferry passengers. However, as for Charlie, he may have the necessary mens rea of murder, oblique intent, or he may have the necessary mens rea of unlawful act manslaughter through recklessness. It just depends on which way the prosecution will prove and whether the jury finds that it was a virtual certain consequence of his actions or that he was subjectively reckless. So here, in the mark scheme, are the levels. So straight away from reading this answer, I know it will be 100% above level 3. It'll be level 3 or above. So I'm not going to analyze these last two paragraphs, but if you want, you can try and analyze the rest of it yourself. So let's read the level 4. Excellent knowledge and understanding of the English legal system, rules and principles. The response is accurate, fully developed and detailed. There will be excellent citation of fully relevant case law. Are all the case law used relevant? Yes it is. Either the facts or the legal principle are relevant to the scenario. Excellent knowledge and understanding of the English legal system. I'd say there is an excellent knowledge and understanding, and that is demonstrated here in this third paragraph and at the end of this third paragraph and the fourth paragraph when they identify subjective recklessness. Is the response accurate? The examiner will also judge whether the response is accurate. Overall, the response is accurate, fully developed and detailed. However, it could be developed a bit further here in transferred malice. For the transferred malice, you could have explained a bit more into transferred malice. I feel like that was a bit light. Oblique intent was very heavy, and so was the bit for subjective recklessness, in my opinion. So I'd say that would be worth 8 marks, because generally it is consistent and fully developed and detailed. Just this minor slight error, and the examiner would overlook this, and they're told to overlook this. It just needs to be overall, it needs to be fully developed and detailed. It's not supposed to be 100%, as that would pretty much be impossible, close to impossible. Not impossible, but close to it. And then for the AO2, there need to be an excellent application of legal rules to a given scenario, excellent presentation of a legal argument which is accurate, fully developed and detailed, fully appropriate legal terminology should be used. So here, the first, second, and third paragraph, and even fourth paragraph, the application of the rules defined in the AO1 is perfectly applied to the scenario. I would barely be able to critique that. Perhaps slightly in this transferred malice, but other than that, it's perfect. Excellent presentation of a legal argument which is accurate. It is accurate. There's nowhere where it's inaccurate. And appropriate legal terminology. And we've all read it, and throughout it there was an appropriate amount of legal terminology. There was nowhere where it was inappropriate or irrelevant to use the legal terminology. And so I'd give it an 11 out of 12 for the AO2 and perhaps an 8 out of 8 for the AO1. And that would obviously be worth 19 out of 20 marks. Perhaps I am being rather strict, but this was a very good answer. Now that you've seen the mark scheme and you know how to go through the mark scheme, and you should understand that you don't need to cover all the indicative content in the mark scheme, and other content that is valid is also acceptable and it will be credited. So as long as you don't waffle completely and go off the tracks, then your answer should generally be credit worthy, as long as it's relevant to the scenario and you don't end up discussing the specific crimes, because a lot of people ended up discussing the specific crimes. So go ahead, try this answer for yourself, and if you already have, mark it and assess it and see how many marks out of 20 you think you deserve. Other than that, I'll see you in the next video. Bye.